All right, under this stormy cloud, beautiful but majestic, we want to talk about the justice of God. And the justice of God is something that was always preached from the earliest times. And I mean, even in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well. We'll be looking at Romans 2, verse 12, and then 14 to 16. I'll get to that in a moment. But we have discovered that God manifests his wrath against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. Now, this is the thing that we need to consider, because it's not just this unrighteous one and that unrighteous, it's all. And that includes people that sit under the gospel ministry a lot, and people that don't, people that haven't. And so we need to ask this. So we humbly ask how the holy and just God excuses showing his wrath against those who have not known Bible truths. That's a common question. And you and I ought to know the answer to this. We ought to be able to give a reasonable and accurate answer for this. The world generally supposes that we enter this world with no instruction book, we suffer through various pains with no explanation, and we pass from this life with no guidebook. This makes them feel justified in making up their own path and inventing their own religious experiences. The world's philosophers, who have only the input of their own senses, provide no sure help for man. They have no idea of what's beyond, because only God knows that, and they're not looking to him. Our Calvinist friends tell us that God chooses some for salvation, leaves the others to damnation. Some of them actually say he chooses them for damnation, but most of them don't say that. While this bypasses the question of God's justice, they tell us to be content with the paradox that God sovereignly chooses and still finds fault with man. Their theme verse is Romans 9:20. Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God, or disputest with God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? Well, this verse is very important to caution us to reverence as we think of God's motives. It does not actually explain anything. And so I ask the question, is there an explanation? And I think there is. So let's look first of all at the testimony, consider the testimony of this passage, Romans 2, verse 12, and then 14 to 16. Here it is. For as many as have sinned without law, outside the law, without having access to the law, shall also perish without law. This is dealing with that very thing. The people that didn't have the Bible, how do they deal with that? He says they will perish without law. So they're not judged by the law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. You see the contrast. Now, verse 14. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law show that there is a law, that they have a law, that they are a law unto themselves. There's a right and wrong in themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts. Unknown to them, it's written right there in their hearts. This is what makes them feel certain things are right and wrong. Their conscience also bearing witness, and the King James margin tells us this could be translated, the conscience witnessing with them, and their thoughts, the meanwhile, or between themselves, accusing or else excusing one another, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. According to my gospel then seems to be that he made sure that this whole concept of God judging sin at the end was part of the gospel. And it makes sense, because you're saying, I want to tell you how to be saved, and their question is, saved from what? You say, oh, well, you didn't know that the judgment is coming. So he addresses the man without a Bible, the Gentiles which have not the law. Some of these Gentiles would have lived in an area where Jews worshiped. They could have had contact with the Word of God, but did not choose to do it. So for this reason, we see that in this passage, he's dealing with both Gentiles who had no opportunity to have the law, those who were away from Jewish people, and those who chose to avoid having the law. They had some acquaintance with it, but not for me. So this is the same as most people in our country, in our culture. Today, if you see anybody talking about it, they look at the Bible, but only to find a reason to mock at it. Somebody was making a comment about the moon. It says, well, the Bible says that the moon is a light. You can't land on light. So mocking that the Bible is stupid, see? It just reveals themselves to be quite ignorant themselves. Then secondly, he points out that these, without the law, adopt a law to themselves. They do by nature the things contained in the law. These are a law unto themselves. So the non-Christian and even the anti-Christian, the people that call themselves atheists, have weaponized their belief, and they are actually anti-Christian. They are speaking against the things of God. They have a sense of morality and act on that moral law. We often see unbelieving liberal churches very active in charities and activist causes. I see this on TV all the time when there's a problem, shooting or some horrible thing. In fact, they are convinced that their activism is the only hope to change things for the better. So I don't mean to laugh at them, because this is important to them, and it's, I think, important for people to feel they're doing something. But they hold vigils with candles, and they release balloons to raise consciousness. How effective is this? I don't know. I saw a balloon today, decided to change my life. I don't know, I've mentioned this before. Walter Isaacson's biography of Benjamin Franklin, he relates how Franklin found the gospel messages of his friend George Whitefield distasteful, with all the theology and bloodshed. He liked the kind of religions invented by the Asians that emphasized the practical correcting of bad traits, Confucianism and these things. It doesn't even talk about God. It's just talking about right and wrong and how to handle life, how to be polite, how to have certain characteristics. It's all about how to live. So Benjamin Franklin, decided he would come up with a better system for himself. He decided to list 12 virtues that would take him to, in his words, moral perfection. His first difficulty was making the list. He showed it to a Quaker friend who suggested he add humility and gave him several examples of Franklin's pride. So he added humility as number 13. His second difficulty came as he worked toward moral perfection, even in this limited approach, and he said, I was surprised to find myself so much fuller of faults than I had imagined. Don't you guess so? He changed his general approach to concentrating on one virtue each week. He thought he was going to whip them off one day at a time. This let him repeat each quest for virtue 4 times a year, every quarter. Problems came up. He found he was naturally a sloppy man, and he wrestled with the virtue of being orderly. Now, he had listed that. He had defined it as, let all your things have their places, let each part of your business have its times. This consistently reminded him that he could not change his nature. He just stayed sloppy. He resorted to rationalism. You know what that means? He said he decided that he was too busy to put everything away, and that he had a good enough memory to find what he needed. And he concluded that being too orderly was just too feminine, like a girl putting the stuff away. So, kind of crossed that one out. Another thorn in his side was that 13th virtue of humility. So, after having done this for quite a while, he said, he confessed, I cannot boast of much success in acquiring the reality of this virtue, true humility, but I had a good deal with respect to the appearance of it. I started looking more humble. He said, you will see it perhaps often in this history. He's writing history of his life. For even if I could conceive that I had completely overcome it, I would probably be proud of my humility. And that, of course, is our problem. Isaacson said, indeed, he would always indulge a bit of pride in discussing his moral perfection project. But Franklin utterly failed perfection by his own admission. Now, I bring this up again if you've heard me say it even recently, because this is the example that we want to take. My point C, he began with the conclusion those without the law are convicted. They will perish without law. And Dr. Francis Schaeffer gave this illustration. I thought it just well imagined and so on. He says, imagine that every baby has a tiny, powerful recorder placed around its neck at birth. This recorder is programmed to record every moral judgment this person would ever speak. When he said a person was wrong for what he did, it records it. Finally, the person dies, stands before God at the judgment. God recognizes that person as one without a Bible. He sends an angel to push the play button on the recorder. All of heaven hears all the things this person judged to be wrong in his lifetime. Perhaps thousands of moral judgments pour forth. Finally, it ends, and God turns to the individual. God turns, looks right at him and says, on the basis of your own words, have you kept these moral standards? There we go. On the basis of your own words, have you kept these moral standards? The individual is silent, hangs his head. Like Franklin, he admits he did not keep his own standards. And so in Schaeffer's illustration, God says, I will judge you upon your own moral statements that you used to condemn others. And this seems to be what God is saying. They are judged without the law, but judged by the law that they have in their own hearts. We see this given to us in Romans 2:1. Therefore thou art inexcusable. This means without defense, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself, you see. For thou that judgest doest the same things. When you violate your own law, it counts against you. Now God gives this warning often. Matthew 12:36, notice this. But I say unto you that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. When the lost stand before God in the judgment, he will bring up everything they said. They say, I didn't mean that. It was just idle words. He says, yeah, we have to give account for it. Because you sent that out to the ears of all the people around you, and it affected them. Luke 12:2-3. For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known. Therefore whatsoever is spoken in darkness shall be heard in light. That which is spoken in the ear in closets shall be proclaimed upon the housetops. What an embarrassing time. Things you thought nobody ever would hear. It's on the loudspeaker. Your voice. Revelation 20:12. And I saw the dead, here's at the great white throne judgment, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And then it says the dead were judged out of those things that were written in the books, according to their works. What's going on here? Well, the angel opens the book of life, because the book of life, just briefly, and you have to read a lot of scripture to get this, but the book of life, your name is entered in at the moment you have achieved life. Not that you achieved it, but you've been given life. And that is when your first beginning cell has been fertilized, and you became a reality. And your name, the name that God has for you, somehow a name that seems to describe all that you are, like your DNA strands. And so that name is written in the book of life. Life has begun. And that life, that gift of life, is forever. You were created in the image of God. You will live somewhere forever. We ought to learn how to live, huh? And so what happens is, during your life, if you accept the gospel of Christ, then you get real life. You get the kind of life that God intended, the kind of life that he gave to Adam and Eve. But if you reject that, then you continue with the dying life. It will still be everlasting, but it just wastes away, and that will be in hell forever. So he opens the book of life to see, because when you die rejecting Christ, the name is blotted out. The angel can actually go, I don't know how it's listed alphabetically, or maybe angels don't need all that help, but they get to the place where your name had been written and find it blanked out. Turns to Christ on the throne and says, the name has not been found. And then they open the other books. See, that's the idea here. Once it's determined that he rejected life, the angel checks the other books of their works to determine the severity of their eternal punishment. It's not quite clear what all this means, but Christ gave this example. He said to Bethsaida, Chorazin, and Capernaum, great cities that he had done a lot of miracles in, and he said, "Oh, woe unto these cities! For if the miracles that I have done in you had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented with ashes and sackcloth. They would have mourned their sin. He said, if the miracles that I did in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, famous Gentile cities right next to the Jewish cities, they would have repented." And he makes this summation that it will be better for them in the day of judgment than for you. So what makes the difference in the judgment? It's that how often you rejected the truth, not some idea that this was a worse sin or that's a worse sin. Because Sodom and Gomorrah was guilty of horrible sins that perhaps were not as widely known in Capernaum. But it'll be worse for Capernaum. The person that's going to get it worse of all will be the person who comes often to a Bible preaching church and hears the gospel and says, "Not today, not today, not today." Number 2, consider the importance of sharing the coming judgment of God. We're talking about revival, and I don't want to get into it now, but we're hearing about revival in the church, the school at Asbury, and then what was the other school? Cedarville. It's kind of spread to there. Now, I'm not going to make judgments. I had a fellow tell me that if it doesn't follow the revivals of the Bible, then I don't believe it. And the thing is, I've spent a lot of time looking at all this, and what we call revival in history never happened in the Bible. You can't find it. You find reform. You have a king that's a good king, and he initiates reform, but you don't find revival. You don't find what happened in these revivals. What we're seeing here seems to be, I'll say, frothy and emotional, but that's the way these things began. People came to mock at this and then stayed to cry and scream and fall on the floor and stuff. So I'm not going to make a judgment. I'm not there, and I'm not interested in going. But maybe this is a beginning, and I prefer to think that this might be the beginning of what we've been asking and praying for and needing, because there's only two choices for the United States of America. One is condemnation, and the other is revival. So consider the importance of sharing the coming judgment of God. It shows man's responsibility before God. When you're preaching judgment, you're saying, listen, God is holding you responsible for what you do. It speaks of man's significance. It reveals the character of God with his holiness and his sovereign authority. He's the judge. Christ, specifically, is the judge of all the last judgments. It verifies the feelings of guilt from a man's conscience, that it's actually based on real guilt before God. It reveals God's purpose for the life of man by explaining the dread consequences of neglecting that purpose. You know, if the car decides I'm going to do everything except travel, my car is in the shop, not traveling, but $800-900 worth of brake works. I think I'll get it back. Going to have to sell my shoes, but that must be pretty expensive shoes, huh? But all of that to say that cars that don't travel, but would be great to play the radio. This is not what a car is for. See, you have a drill that does everything except turn. You know what good are these things? And so if you are created with a purpose and you're doing everything except that purpose, then it's kind of worthless. You're wasting life. So it shows God's concern for man with his offer of avoiding that last judgment altogether. All of this is shown when we explain man's responsibility before God. But secondly, it shows man's relationship with God. For instance, if we neglect proclaiming God's judgment of lost mankind, we imply one of two things. If we don't speak of judgment, I just don't want to talk about that. Well, then you're implying one of two things. Either God is not just, because an unjust God is either powerless or a mere invention of man. In either case, we fall into the condemnation of Friedrich Nietzsche, the God is dead philosopher. He said, man outgrew his need of a make-believe God. God is dead. Therefore, the moral system based on the Judeo-Christian God is forfeit. There are no absolutes of morality. Every man chooses his own moral code. And this greatly influenced Adolf Hitler, who decided might was power, and ultimate might gave him ultimate power. So are you ready to imply that God is not just and therefore won't condemn? Or maybe it's the other way around, and that is that man is just insignificant, not important enough to judge. There may be a God somewhere involved in God business, but it does not concern man. Man is irrelevant. He is a speck in the universe. He makes no difference in his life or in his death. The things that give our life meaning are illusions. There is no love, but only lust and desire. There is no beauty, only lures of desire. Helping others is a weakness that robs me of my wealth and my energy. You want to imply that? Or is man significant enough that God is taking notice and will judge? So then proclaiming God's judgment implies that man is individually responsible to God. Again, Romans 2:1 and 3a, therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, the phrase. Thinkest thou this, O man? You see, both words man, human being, by the way, anthropos means a human being, not a male versus a female, man referring to humanity. These words are singular here. Here God addresses you as an individual. He knows you. He speaks to you. You are significant. Your decisions are important. So, speaking of God's judgment means man is individually responsible and significant. B, God is holy and condemns sin. Romans 1:16-18, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. Now, salvation asks the question, saved from what? To everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, wherever you are, whatever your experience, who hold the truth in unrighteousness. And then point C, God loves man enough to offer salvation. When you preach judgment, you're saying you can avoid that judgment because of the love of God. The gospel says that God offered his son, Jesus, to die for you, that you might have everlasting life. Romans 5:8, but God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, spewing out animosity to God, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And then point C, it shows we are responsible to share the message of God's condemnation. Why are you trying to push your religion? because God is going to judge you, and you need to know that. And you need to know there's a way out of it. Number one, we have the answer to man's eternal condition. John 3:36, he that believeth on the Son hath everlasting life. He that believeth not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth on him. We need to tell them. And number two, we have the answer to man's present condition, the way his life is going. John 5:40, he says to obviously living people, he says, you will not come to me that you might have life. You have this semblance of life. You have this passing illusion of life. But I can give you real life. This is the fullness of life, found only in relationship with the God of life. And of course, John 10:10b, I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. How wonderful is that? To have actual abundant life. So we are not ashamed, as Paul said, of the gospel that actually speaks of the judgment of God on sin. Not for the Christian. Christ took that judgment. We do not stand at the judgment bar. I was looking at an old song. I didn't know the song, but it says, we will stand at the judgment bar. No, we won't. Actually, we didn't. Christ stood on that judgment bar and received the penalty for our sin. We don't have to go. We don't stand before the judgment seat of God. The judgment seat of Christ we do, because that's the rewards, or not, but not the legal thing. We're not judged by the law. It's very clear. All right, please.